Good morning, David.
Good morning, Salim.
David, how can we learn from the history of risk management?
Yes, there are two ways of understanding this question. One is, how can risk management learn from the history of the events we've already been through, learning from experience? And the other is the history of risk management and what can we learn from the way that we used to manage risk in the past. So let's take the first one first. How can we learn from experience in risk management? There are two types of learning experience. We can learn from the things that went well. We can learn from the things that did not go well.
Yes.
And so it's important that we look, that we review our experience, that we are reflective individuals and teams and organizations, and that we see, we tried to do this, did it work or did it not work? And we need to know how to distinguish those. And then if it didn't work, why was that? Was that something that we could change? What would we do differently in the future so that it would work? Is there something that was not our responsibility that happened to us that we could protect ourselves from or change the way that we work? And so we learn from our negative lessons. We talked in an earlier question about failure, the way we think about failure. If failure is a problem and it's something to be blamed for and something negative, or if it's a learning experience. And we should see it as an opportunity to learn something new.
Yes.
Don't do that again, but do this instead. But also we can learn from the positives. You know, we tried to manage this risk and it really worked well. So here is a response that we should share with other people, that we should tell our colleagues and maybe others in our industry, if you're subject to this particular bad thing, try this, it worked for us. Or here's a particular opportunity that we were able to capture. Why don't you try our same approach and maybe it will help you? And so learning from experience in the positive is also really, really important. I mentioned this saying that I have in an earlier answer, but it's worth sharing again.
Yes.
I say, if a risk happens once, that's understandable. You know, risk happens, it's a matter of chance and probability, so
Yes.
sometimes things just happen. If the same risk happens twice, that's unfortunate. You could just be unlucky. First time, it's understandable.
Yes.
Second time, that's just unfortunate. If the same risk happens 3 times, that's unacceptable.
Yes.
We need to learn from the past.
Yes.
And if, I met the head of projects for head of projects for a major pharmaceutical company with a colleague about 15 years ago. And we were talking about risks. The first time I'd met this man, a senior scientist in this pharmaceutical company and responsible for all of their drug development projects. He said, we've got a real problem with risk. He said, the same risks happen on all our projects all the time.
Oh.
And I said, without thinking, I said, that's stupid. Well, I can't say that. He's the client. He's an important person. He said, why did you say that? And I said, well, risk is about uncertainty. And if the same things happen every time, there's no uncertainty. If it's every time, why aren't you dealing with it and stopping it happening? And, if it's every time, there is no uncertainty. You know it's going to happen next time as well. Yes. And it was because they didn't know how to learn from experience. They weren't capturing that knowledge and building it into their future processes. Yes. So fortunately, we were able to help them. In fact, my colleague who I went with 15 years ago is still helping that particular company today.
Maybe they didn't know, but at the same time, maybe also they didn't take any action.
Yes.
They knew about the problem, but they didn't care.
And we talked about learning lessons, that actually you don't learn a lesson until you've put it into practice next time.
Of course.
So we have lessons learned reviews, and they identify lessons that we could learn, but we haven't actually learned it until we do it. And often you get these kind of review sessions at the end of a strategy planning session or a particular initiative or a project, where you say, well, what went well, what did not go well, what lessons can we learn? And then you stop. You don't take any action, and nothing changes because you identified the lesson but didn't act on it.
Yes.
So that's the first answer to the question. Perhaps more briefly, the other way of looking at this question about what can we learn from the history of risk management is to look into the history of the development of risk management as a discipline.
Yes.
And certainly there are a number of things we can learn by looking back at the originators of the discipline as we have it. Perhaps one of the first fathers of risk management was a philosopher in France called Pascal. He's a mathematician, of course.
Mathematician, yes,
and he would be playing games of chance with dice and with cards, and had a situation where if they stopped the game in the middle and they were betting on the game. I would never bet on a game of cards, but that's what they were doing. If they stopped in the middle, they got interrupted. How could they decide what to do with the money? Do they give you back what you put in, or is there some way of predicting who would have won if from this position? And so he developed a whole sort of interest in probability theory based on the idea that from where we are with these cards or these dice, it would have gone this way. It's more likely to go this way than this way. I would have won. I'll take the money. And so that he's one of the first fathers. What we learn from that is that risk management is real and practical. It should address real problems. The idea of insurance came about in the 1700s when the British particularly, but also the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish were trading merchant ships around the world. And we would send ships to the Far East, to India and to China, and to bring back the riches, and we would buy them and trade them back in Europe. And ships would go and they would sink, or ships would go and they would come back and be fabulously wealthy. And so what we did was we invented insurance in London. The Lloyd's of London started to insure the voyage. And in fact, the word risk was originally used, the Italian word risicare means to voyage, to set sail. So you risk the ship because there are two outcomes. You come back wealthy or you sink and die. So insurance was used to take money from the people who came back wealthy, and if a ship sank, they would give the money to the ship that sank. It was addressing a real problem. And of course the problem was that the term insurance came to be associated with the sinking ship, with the loss. So we always saw risk as a negative thing, but originally it was two possible outcomes. So we learn from that risk is about addressing real problems. And that's something important to consider. And all of these founding fathers of risk management who had particular approaches developed something for a reason. It's very easy for us to forget our history. And we were talking earlier about culture. And, you know, where does your culture come from, or my culture? Who am I? Who are we? And where did we come from, and how did we get here? Both as individuals and families, but also as communities and nations. And we need to learn our history and remember our history. There's a philosopher called Santayana, Georg Santayana. Those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. We need to learn those things again. So it is important that we remember our history, we look back at the fathers, understand why they discovered these things, and continue to learn from them.
In fact, it does help, because knowing the past, it makes you really understand and appreciate the present. And trying to predict the future.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Very interesting.